everyone, welcome back to Tea and Lit. In today's video we are going to be doing our author spotlight for George Orwell, or more correctly, Eric Blair. So our book this month is 1984 by George Orwell, and so as I've said before, I think it's important to do a little bit of research about your authors before you read their stories, because the author puts a little piece of themselves in their work. So let's talk about him. Eric Blair was born on June 25th, 1903 in India. His father was a colonel in His Majesty's Armed Services. I think we're in the Georgian era by then. I think. George VI. I suppose we could ask Mr. Google Pants. Who was the monarch in 1903? Dear Mr. Google Pants, dear Mr. Google Pants, who was British monarch in 1903? Edward VII. Oh, you fool. So it was the Edwardian era seems quite lovely, actually. So he was born into the Edwardian era. His father was a colonel in the Edwardian armed services. Very soon after his birth, his mother moved him and his older sister, named Avril, was his younger sister. His older sister was Marjorie. Him and his older sister back to England, where he went to Eton, which is like the super fancy private school over in the UK. Like the royals send their kids there. And while there, he noticed that there was like a very clear distinction between like the super rich kids that went to Eton and like the not super rich kids that went to Eton. He was not super rich, and like his parents couldn't afford to send him to university, so he did not continue his education, but decided that he wanted to be a writer. First, he went to India and tried to be in His Majesty's army. Do you call King's Majesty? I think so. But it didn't really work out. He ended up leaving the services and decided that he wanted to be a writer, so he moved to England first and then down to France, and that's where he wrote one of his first books, and he wasn't very successful, as so many artists aren't, and so he moved back to England. He got married to Eileen O'Shaughnessy. I don't know if it was England. It was the United Kingdom. He married Eileen O'Shaughnessy in June 1936, and they went down to Spain with the crazy idea that they were going to help, fight in the Spanish Civil War. And he got driven out basically by communists that were backed up by Joseph Stalin. So him and Joseph Stalin were not friends. I say that loosely. He did not like Joseph Stalin, and actually wrote Animal Farm as like a screw you to Joseph Stalin. So after reading 1984, I don't think that I'm going to read Animal Farm, at least not anytime soon, but maybe someday. His father had stayed in India at his post until his retirement, and then he went back to England and was with the family. And George Orwell, Mr. Blair, Eric Blair, and his father weren't like really, he found his dad to be boring and conservative, and so he didn't really like him very much. I'm going to just call him George Orwell, okay? I'm just going to call him by his pseudonym. He was an anarchist and a socialist, because who in their 20s and 30s aren't anarchists and socialists? He was a very sick child growing up. He always had bronchitis or the flu, and then he ended up being a very sick older gentleman. He died at the age of 46 of tuberculosis. Before that, though, his wife Eileen had died in 1945. It said that they had an open marriage, and just a few months before his death, he got married to Sonia Brownell in October 1949, and then George died in January 21st, 1950, if I'm remembering what I wrote down. Yeah, January 21st, 1950. So he had married Sonia just before his death, and basically after he died, she ran the estate. And if I'm not mistaken, she's also dead, and she sold the rights to the book to the George Orwell Foundation, who currently owns the copyright, even though it really should be in the public domain, because it's in the public domain in Canada, it's in the public domain in Australia, it'll be in the public domain in the European Union next year, and it won't be for like another long time in the US, which is why we cannot have George Orwell swag. Even though he's been dead for like 70 years. Sucks. Like 70 years. He's been dead for 70 years. Whatever. He had one adopted son that he adopted with Eileen named Richard Horatio. And after Eileen died, basically the child was raised by George's younger sister, Avril. When he was in Spain, he was fighting against General Franco. Have I said everything I wanted to say? Oh, he was a propagandist for the BBC from 1941 to 1943. And he found that to be like not the most life-affirming job, to be creating propaganda basically for the party. And I imagine he took a lot of inspiration from that life experience to create Winston Smith, who is the main character of 1984. But yeah, he wrote for a super lefty magazine after leaving his post at the BBC. But I think that a lot of his life experience, you know, not being treated as well as the rich kids at Eton, growing up, seeing the First World War and the Second World War, probably is what inspired the writing of 1984. I will say though, some of the things he writes about in 1984 did not come into being until now. So, you know, he was a little ahead of his time in his concerns for the dystopic world that would be rung in. So there's that, I guess. Anyway, the last thing I want to share is this quote that I found of him, because it's just so poignant for today. He said, "In our age, there is no such thing as keeping out of politics. All issues are political issues, and politics itself is a mass of lies, evasions, folly, hatred, and schizophrenia." Because we're in an existential state of being, and I've said it before, I will say it again, I think 2020 is going to end horribly. So, things will get brighter eventually. They always do. They always do. Eventually. They get better, and then they get worse again. Because there's no point to anything. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time. Bye!